Camille Ortiz had carried trays through rooms like this one for 4 years, long enough to master the particular art of moving through a crowd that looked past her the way people looked past furniture. Present, useful, entirely unremarkable. She worked at her cousin Inez's catering company because the money was steady and the job was simple. And she'd made peace, somewhere around year 2, with the specific invisibility the work required. Nobody at a gala like this one wanted to actually see the woman refilling their champagne. They wanted the champagne refilled, silently, by someone whose face they'd forget the moment she stepped away from the table. Camille had built a quiet kind of competence around that exact expectation, gliding through crowded rooms with a tray balanced steady on one palm, offering nothing beyond efficient, invisible service. The Holloway Anniversary Gala filled the hotel ballroom with the specific, glittering excess of people who measured an evening's success by how much it cost to attend. Chandeliers throwing warm light across tables set with more silverware than most of the guests would actually use. Camille worked the far side of the room, refilling glasses with the same practiced, unhurried rhythm she brought to every event, until she reached the table where Priscilla and Ward Holloway sat holding court among a cluster of equally polished guests. "More wine," Priscilla said without looking up, sliding her glass toward the edge of the table with the particular carelessness of someone who'd never once had to consider whether a stranger's day was going well. Camille poured carefully, silent, the old, practiced discipline of absorbing whatever came next without visible reaction. She'd absorbed worse than careless glances over 4 years of catering work. Comments about her weight, her uniform, her general presence in rooms built for people who looked considerably different than she did. "Honestly," Priscilla said, turning to Ward with a light, performative laugh that carried just enough volume to ensure the surrounding tables caught it too. "I don't know how these companies hire their staff. You'd think, for an event this size, they'd at least try to keep appearances up. Unlike some people, apparently." Ward chuckled along, the specific, reflexive laugh of a man who'd learned decades ago that agreeing with his wife cost less than not agreeing. Neither of them looked directly at Camille, though the comment's target was unmistakable to everyone within earshot, including Camille herself, standing close enough to refill the glass Priscilla had just weaponized her own casual cruelty around. Camille felt the old, familiar heat climb her neck, for years of practiced restraint warring against something that had finally, after countless smaller cruelties, worn dangerously thin. She set the pitcher down on the table. Not gently, the specific, deliberate weight of the motion drawing eyes from the surrounding tables in a way her presence never usually managed. "If you mock me again," Camille said, her voice carrying clearly across a table that had suddenly gone very quiet, "I'll make sure the whole room hears exactly what I think of you both. Every word." The silence that followed carried a specific, startled weight, Priscilla's practiced composure flickering for the first time all evening, Ward's chuckle dying mid-breath. Camille didn't wait for a response. She turned and walked back toward the kitchen with her spine straight, the accumulated fury of 4 years finally, momentarily released. Inez caught her before she'd made it fully through the service doors, her cousin's face carrying the specific panicked urgency of someone who'd witnessed at least part of the confrontation from across the room. "Camille." Inez pulled her aside, voice low and urgent. "Do you understand who that was? The Halloways could end this business with one phone call. But we can't afford what just happened out there." "I know exactly who they were," Camille said, exhaustion finally breaking through the adrenaline of the confrontation. "I've known for 4 years exactly what people like that think they're allowed to say to people like me. I'm done pretending it doesn't cost me something every single time I let it go." 2 tables away, a man in a dark suit who'd been watching the Halloways all evening for reasons that had nothing to do with anniversary celebrations set his own glass down slowly, filing away something he hadn't expected to hear tonight. Enzo Marchetti hadn't come to the Holloway Gala for champagne or conversation. He'd come because Ward Holloway's shipping company had been underbidding his own legitimate logistics contracts for months in a pattern that made no financial sense unless something considerably less legitimate was subsidizing the difference. And galas like this one offered exactly the kind of casual proximity that formal meetings never quite provided. He'd watched the Halloways across the room for over an hour, cataloging the specific practiced ease of people accustomed to never facing real consequence, when the caterer's confrontation unfolded 2 tables away with a directness that caught his full attention. Priscilla's comment lingered with him longer than the confrontation itself, keeping appearances up unlike some people. The specific phrasing landing oddly close to language he'd heard used before, in considerably more clinical contexts, about the Holloway's finances. He'd heard it from an accountant reviewing shipping manifests months earlier. A phrase about maintaining appearances that had nothing to do with anyone's weight and everything to do with covering gaps in cash flow that shouldn't have existed for a company posting the losses Ward's company quietly carried. He watched Ward's flustered deflection following Camille's confrontation, the specific practiced smoothness of a man accustomed to managing crises through charm rather than substance, and felt an old, familiar instinct sharpen into focus. "Find out who the caterer is," he told his security chief quietly without taking his eyes off the Holloway's table. "The woman who just confronted them. Not to cause her trouble. I want to understand what she might know." His security chief nodded, already moving toward the kitchen with the specific discreet efficiency Enzo had come to rely on across years of careful, methodical investigation work. Enzo returned his attention to the Holloway's table, watching Priscilla's composure slowly rebuild itself, Ward's forced laughter working to smooth over a moment that had clearly rattled him considerably more than his careful public performance suggested. The following morning arrived with news that confirmed exactly how much damage a single confrontation could cause when the offended party held real social leverage. Ines called Camille before dawn, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. "They pulled the contract," Ines said, the words arriving flat with exhausted disbelief. "The Halloways. First thing this morning. And it's not just them. Priscilla's been calling around telling people you caused a scene, that we can't be trusted at formal events." Camille felt the floor tilt beneath her, the specific sinking horror of watching consequence arrive exactly as fast and as devastating as her cousin had warned it might. "How bad?" "2 bookings cancelled already," Ines said. "For next month. If this keeps spreading, we lose considerably more than 2 events, Camille. This business runs on thin margins and reputation." Priscilla Holloway just decided to burn both. Camille sat with the guilt rising fast and familiar, the specific old shame of believing she'd finally spoken up for herself only to watch that choice cost someone else considerably more than she'd bargained for. "I'm sorry," she said, though the apology felt hollow even as she offered it. "I should have just stayed quiet the way I always have." "I'm not asking you to apologize," Ines said, though her voice carried genuine mounting stress. "I'm telling you what's actually happening because I don't know how we survive this if it keeps spreading." The call ended without resolution, and Camille sat alone in her apartment, the fresh cycle of shame she'd thought she'd finally outgrown reasserting itself with familiar, exhausting weight. She'd spent one moment finally refusing to shrink herself, and the cost had landed not on her alone, but on the one person who'd always treated her like family rather than furniture. The knock on the catering office door came 3 days later, while Camille sat with Ines reviewing which of their remaining clients might still be salvageable. Enzo Marchetti stood in the doorway, dressed with the same careful precision she remembered from the gala, though his expression carried none of the distant, calculating focus she recalled from across that crowded ballroom. "I'm not here to apologize for eavesdropping," he said before either woman could ask why a stranger had appeared at their office door. "I'm here because I think you might know something considerably more important than you realize." Camille studied the man in her cousin's small, cluttered office with the specific guarded wariness of someone who'd already learned, 3 days earlier, exactly how fast a powerful person's attention could reshape her entire life without her consent. "I don't know what you think I know," she said, arms crossed, exhaustion and suspicion tangled together in her voice. "I poured wine at a party and told 2 rich people not to mock me again. That's the whole story." "I don't think it's the whole story," Enzo said, settling into the chair Ines offered without being asked, his voice carrying none of the careless authority Camille had braced herself to encounter. "I think you were standing close enough to that table all evening to have heard considerably more than you realize is significant." Ines watched the exchange with visible, mounting tension, the specific calculation of a woman whose business already teetered on collapse weighing whether this unexpected visitor represented further danger or genuine opportunity. "Who exactly are you?" she asked, the question carrying real weight beneath its plain phrasing. "Enzo Marchetti," he said, offering the name plainly, without the practiced charm Camille had watched Ward Holloway deploy across an entire evening. "I run a logistics company. Ward Holloway's business has been underbidding my legitimate contracts for months in a way that doesn't make financial sense, unless something illegal is subsidizing the difference. I've been watching him for reasons that have nothing to do with your confrontation." I just happened to be close enough to hear it. Camille absorbed that old wariness warring against genuine growing curiosity. So what do you actually want from me? Precise questions, Enzo said, meeting her eyes directly. Who else was seated at that table? What exactly Priscilla said about appearances, word for word if you can remember it. Whether you noticed anyone unfamiliar in the room that evening, anyone who seemed out of place among the usual crowd. Camille hesitated, the specific discomfort of being asked to reconstruct a night that had already cost her cousin's business considerably more than she'd bargained for. Why should I tell you anything? The last time I got involved in whatever's happening around the Halloways, it nearly destroyed the one thing keeping my family's business afloat. Because I think what you overheard might be exactly what ends up saving it, Enzo said, the certainty in his voice carrying genuine, careful weight rather than empty reassurance. Ward's been protected for years by exactly the kind of social untouchability his wife just weaponized against you. If I'm right about what's actually funding his underbidding, exposing it doesn't just settle a business dispute between our companies. It removes the leverage that let the Halloways destroy your cousin's reputation with a single phone call in the first place. Camille studied him a long moment, weighing the risk of trusting a stranger against the specific, mounting desperation of watching her cousin's business collapse under a cruelty she hadn't fully anticipated the cost of confronting. I remember a guest at the table, she said slowly, working the memory loose with careful, deliberate effort. Someone I didn't recognize mentioned an account. Cayman Islands, I think. Ward hushed him almost immediately, changed the subject so fast it felt strange even at the time, though I didn't think much of it until just now. Enzo went very still, something sharp and focused settling into his expression. You're certain about the location? Cayman Islands. I'm certain, Camille said. I remember thinking it sounded like something from a movie, not an actual conversation happening 2 feet from where I was pouring wine. That's exactly the detail I needed, Enzo said, and something in the specific genuine gratitude of his voice landed differently than Camille expected, considerably warmer than the careful transactional tone she'd braced herself against. Ward's shipping manifests have discrepancies I haven't been able to fully explain yet. An offshore account tied to those discrepancies could be exactly the thread that unravels the entire scheme. Ines leaned forward, cautious hope finally breaking through her earlier, guarded tension. If you expose this, does that actually help our business or does it just settle whatever score you're working through with Ward Halloway? Both, Enzo said plainly. I don't do anything by half measures. If Ward's laundering money through falsified shipping records, exposing that ends his social leverage entirely, which means the pressure campaign against your business collapses along with it. I'm not offering charity. I'm offering a partnership that benefits both of us, built on exactly the detail your cousin happened to overhear. The following 2 weeks unfolded in a careful, methodical rhythm neither Camille nor Ines had expected when Enzo Marchetti first appeared in their cramped office doorway. Enzo's legal team pulling every financial record his lawyers could access while Camille worked to reconstruct the gala conversation piece by careful piece. Here. Enzo spread a series of shipping manifests across Ines's small conference table, the documentation considerably more extensive than the single overheard comment about a Cayman Islands account had originally suggested. 3 years of falsified records. Ward's company reports shipping volumes that don't match the actual cargo movements we've traced through Port Authority logs. The gap between reported and actual volume, that's where the laundering happens. Money moves through as phantom shipping fees, cleaned, and comes back out looking legitimate. Camille studied the documentation with growing, focused understanding, the specific satisfaction of watching a single overheard fragment reveal itself as part of something considerably larger. This has been happening for 3 years and nobody caught it. Nobody looked closely enough, Enzo said. Ward's protected by exactly the kind of social standing his wife weaponized against you at the gala. Nobody audits a company that prominent without expecting real pushback, real consequences for whoever raises the question. That protection only works as long as nobody with real resources decides it's worth the risk of challenging it. And now you're that person, Camille said, working through the implication with careful attention. Now we're that person, Enzo corrected, meeting her eyes directly. You gave me the thread that turned a suspicion I couldn't quite prove into an actual traceable pattern. This isn't just my investigation anymore. Camille felt something shift at that, the specific, unfamiliar weight of being treated as a genuine partner rather than simply a convenient source of information. I don't know anything about shipping manifests or offshore accounts. I don't know what else I could actually contribute beyond what I already told you. You know how to read a room, Enzo said. You spent 4 years watching people like the Halloways up close, cataloging exactly the kind of careless, unguarded comments people make when they assume the person serving them isn't actually listening. That's not a small skill. It's exactly the skill that caught the detail my own investigators missed for months. Ines, listening from across the office, felt her own cautious hope solidify into something steadier. If this actually works, if Ward's exposed, what happens to our business? Priscilla's already spread word that we're unreliable. That damage doesn't just disappear because the Halloways get arrested. It disappears faster than you'd expect, Enzo said. Once the same social circles that punished you for confronting Priscilla understand exactly why she was so desperate to control the narrative, people forgive a caterer standing up to casual cruelty considerably faster than they forgive a federal fraud case unfolding in their own social circle. The old assumptions Camille had built her entire professional identity around, that survival meant staying invisible, that confronting cruelty always cost more than it was worth, began slowly and deliberately to collapse under the weight of watching real consequence finally, genuinely gather around the people who'd spent years assuming their status made them untouchable. I want to keep helping with this, Camille said, the decision arriving with a conviction that surprised even her. Not just handing over what I remember and stepping back. I want to actually understand what we're building here. Enzo studied her, something genuinely respectful moving behind his careful, focused attention. That's not a small commitment. If Ward realizes we're building a case against him and realizes you're part of it, the pressure campaign against your cousin's business could escalate considerably beyond a few cancelled contracts. I understand the risk, Camille said, meeting his eyes with a steadiness that carried none of her earlier caution. I spent 4 years being careful, staying invisible, absorbing whatever people like the Halloways decided to say about me. I'm done deciding that caution is automatically safer than actually fighting for something that matters. It was a decision that couldn't be walked back once made, committing to active involvement in an investigation that could, if it escalated poorly, cost Ines's business considerably more than the 2 cancelled contracts already lost. Priscilla Halloway didn't wait for the investigation to fully close around her husband, and the escalation when it arrived, carried the specific calculated cruelty of a woman who understood exactly how much her family's social standing could still accomplish before anyone managed to prove otherwise. She's pressuring our other clients directly now, Ines reported, urgency tight in her voice as she read through a series of messages that had arrived over the past 2 days. Not just declining to recommend us. Actively calling people, telling them Camille's outburst was part of a pattern of unprofessional behavior, implying there's more we're hiding. Camille felt the familiar dread rise, sharper now than the original panic following the gala confrontation. How many clients? 4 so far, Ines said. We're losing bookings faster than we can replace them. If this keeps up another week, I don't know if the business survives long enough for whatever case Enzo's building to actually matter. Every part of the investigation's careful progress now faced compounding pressure. Enzo's legal team, working methodically through Ward's financial records, forced to accelerate their timeline as the Halloways' retaliation threatened to bankrupt the one witness whose testimony had made the case possible in the first place. I have people looking into who else Priscilla's calling, Enzo said, arriving at the catering office with the same focused urgency that had characterized every visit since the gala. This kind of aggressive pressure campaign this fast tells me they suspect we're closing in faster than they originally calculated. That doesn't help my cousin keep her business running in the meantime, Camille said, frustration audible beneath her genuine fear. Every day this drags out, we lose more clients. I don't know how much longer Ines can absorb this before there's nothing left to save. The setback that followed arrived from a direction none of them had fully anticipated. Ines's phone rang late that evening, and Camille watched her cousin's face shift from dread to genuine, startled confusion as she listened to the caller. That was Judge Alderman's office, Ines said, setting the phone down slowly. One of the clients Priscilla pressured directly. Apparently the judge found the whole thing suspicious enough to ask her own questions. Why a prominent socialite was so aggressively campaigning against a small catering business over what should have been a minor, forgettable incident. Enzo's focused attention sharpened immediately. A judge. That's not a small complication for the Halloways. She wants to know why Priscilla's so invested in destroying us, Ines continued, working through the implication with growing, cautious hope. She specifically asked whether there's something else going on beyond a simple service complaint. That's exactly the kind of scrutiny Priscilla's pressure campaign was never built to survive, Enzo said, something calculating and satisfied moving behind his careful focus. She overplayed her hand, assuming social pressure alone would end this quietly before anyone with real authority thought to ask why. Camille absorbed the news with cautious, mounting relief, though the accumulated exhaustion of the past 2 weeks still weighed heavily against any premature celebration. This helps, but it doesn't finish anything yet. We're still losing clients. Ines is still watching years of work collapse in real time. I know, Enzo said, meeting her eyes with genuine, unguarded acknowledgement of the cost this was extracting from people who'd never asked to be part of a federal investigation. I need the financial trail finalized faster than my original timeline allowed. I'm going to push my people harder, accept some risk in the process I wouldn't normally accept, because waiting for a perfectly airtight case isn't actually serving either of you anymore. The greatest setback arrived the following morning, delivered through Enzo's forensic accountant in a tone that carried genuine, professional alarm. Ward Holloway, sensing the investigation closing in faster than his wife's pressure campaign had managed to slow it, had begun quietly liquidating assets and restructuring accounts. The specific, desperate behavior of a man preparing to disappear rather than face charges he understood were becoming increasingly difficult to avoid. Enzo's forensic accountant delivered the breakthrough 2 days later, spreading documentation across the catering office's small conference table with the specific, focused satisfaction of someone who'd finally assembled proof solid enough to survive any challenge Ward's remaining resources might mount against it. Here. He tapped a series of banking records, the specific undeniable weight of actual evidence replacing weeks of careful patient inference. Direct transfers from the falsified shipping accounts into the Cayman Islands account Camille overheard mentioned at the gala. 3 years of laundered funds fully traced now, connecting the phantom shipping fees directly to an account held under a shell company controlled entirely by Ward Holloway. Camille studied the documentation with growing, grounded relief. The specific satisfaction of watching a single overheard fragment finally, completely prove itself worth the cost it had extracted from everyone involved. This is enough to actually charge him. This is considerably more than enough, Enzo confirmed. Federal fraud charges, money laundering, falsified business records spanning 3 years. Ward doesn't have a defense that survives this level of documentation. Ines leaned over the records, cautious hope finally solidifying into something steadier than she'd allowed herself across the entire ordeal. What happens to our business once this becomes public? The same social circles that punished Camille for confronting Priscilla, Enzo said, are about to understand exactly why Priscilla was so desperate to control the narrative. That reversal happens fast, once people understand the actual stakes behind what looked like a simple service complaint. Camille sat with the accumulated weight of the past 3 weeks, the specific exhausted relief of watching genuine consequence finally, undeniably arrive, settling into something considerably steadier than the raw fear she'd carried through most of the investigation. What happens now? Do we just wait for the arrest? Not quite, Enzo said. I want to move on this before Ward finishes liquidating what he can. My legal team's ready to formally present this to federal prosecutors within the next 2 days. Once that happens, this moves considerably faster than anyone at that gala originally expected. The relationships tested across the past 3 weeks settled into something considerably more honest than their careful, tentative beginning at the catering office door. Camille studied Enzo with genuine, grown respect, understanding, watching him work through the final stages of an investigation that had cost real effort and real risk on his part. That whatever had started as a business dispute had become something considerably more personal to him than simple financial competition. Why did you actually keep pushing this? She asked, the question carrying genuine curiosity rather than lingering suspicion. You could have just quietly outcompete Ward's underbidding once you understood it was fraud subsidizing his prices. You didn't have to build an entire case that risked exposing your own methods. Enzo considered the question with the same careful weight he'd given every important decision across the investigation. Because watching Priscilla weaponize casual cruelty against someone who couldn't easily fight back, and watching it nearly destroy an entire business built by people who did nothing wrong, that's exactly the kind of quiet, unpunished abuse of power that never gets challenged if people with actual resources decide it's not their problem to fix. I had the resources. I decided it was my problem. Camille absorbed that, something warm and genuinely grateful settling into her chest despite the exhaustion of the past 3 weeks. Then let's finish this properly, she said. Not just quietly resolving the business dispute. Making sure Ward answers for all 3 years of it, and making sure Priscilla answers for exactly what she tried to do to my cousin's business in the process. That's precisely the plan, Enzo confirmed, the decision settling with none of his earlier careful hesitation. Federal agents arrested Ward Holloway on fraud and money laundering charges 11 days later. The specific complete collapse of a scheme that had survived 3 years precisely because nobody with sufficient resources had bothered to challenge his family's social untouchability. Camille watched the news break across local coverage from Inez's small office, the same room where Enzo had first appeared 3 weeks earlier with careful, precise questions about a gala confrontation that had nearly destroyed everything her cousin had built. Priscilla's testifying against him, Enzo reported, arriving at the office with news that completed the case's final, unexpected turn. Offered to save herself once the financial trail became undeniable. Apparently she's been aware of the laundering scheme for at least the last year, though her lawyers are working hard to frame her knowledge as considerably more limited than the actual evidence suggests. So she's not facing charges, Camille said, working through the specific complicated justice of watching the woman whose casual cruelty had started this entire chain of events avoid the full consequence her husband now faced. She's facing considerably reduced charges, Enzo clarified, in exchange for testimony that finishes what your outburst at that gala started. It's not the ending either of us might have wanted for her specifically, but it's the ending that ensures Ward can't escape what he actually did. Camille sat with that, the specific complicated satisfaction of justice arriving imperfectly but undeniably nonetheless. I keep thinking about that night, she said slowly. I set a picture down hard enough to draw attention, and I genuinely thought I'd just cost my cousin everything she'd built. I never imagined it would end with federal fraud charges. You didn't cause any of this, Enzo said, meeting her eyes with genuine settled certainty. Ward built this scheme himself over 3 years, protected by exactly the kind of casual cruelty his wife used against you without a second thought. You just happened to be standing close enough and brave enough to notice the detail that finally unraveled it. Inez emerged from the back office, phone in hand, something like disbelief crossing her exhausted features. Bookings are already coming back, she said. 3 new inquiries this morning alone, once word started spreading about what actually happened. People want the caterer who stood up to the Halloways apparently, not the caterer who caused a scene. The external conflict resolved completely, decisively, Ward's 3-year scheme finally, publicly unraveling under the weight of evidence too thorough and too well documented for any remaining social leverage to suppress. Camille watched the specific, satisfying reversal of a narrative that had once threatened to destroy her cousin's livelihood, now instead restoring it considerably stronger than before the gala confrontation had ever occurred. I need to say something, Camille told Enzo once Inez had returned to the growing pile of new client inquiries. You didn't have to keep pushing this investigation once you understood the fraud was real. You could have handled it quietly, protected your own business interests without ever building a public case that risked exposing your own methods. I could have, Enzo agreed. I didn't want to. Watching you stand up for yourself at that gala. That wasn't just brave. It was the first genuine, unguarded thing I'd witnessed in that entire room full of people performing wealth and status at each other all evening. I wasn't going to let that cost you everything, not when I had the resources to make sure it didn't. Camille stood at the entrance of a private dining room 3 months later, watching guests arrive for an intimate anniversary celebration considerably smaller than the Holloway gala that had first appended her carefully invisible life, though this time she wasn't carrying a tray toward the kitchen. Enzo had insisted on becoming a client himself once the investigation fully closed, and tonight's event, a modest celebration for one of his own logistics contracts finally, properly secured, represented exactly the kind of partnership he'd promised weeks earlier. Back when Camille had first agreed to actually understand what they were building together rather than simply handing over what she remembered and stepping back. "You're not working the room tonight," Enzo said, crossing toward her with an easy warmth that had settled naturally into place across the months since Ward's arrest. "I made that clear to Ines. You're a guest at this one." "I don't know how to be a guest," Camille admitted, though her voice carried genuine, unguarded amusement rather than the old anxious deflection she might once have offered. 4 years of catering work and I still feel strange sitting down instead of serving." "You'll learn," Enzo said, guiding her toward a seat at the head table with a confidence that carried none of the careful transactional distance of their earliest meetings. "The same way you learned that speaking up costs less than you always assumed it would." Camille settled into the seat, studying the room with a specific unfamiliar perspective, not cataloging which glasses needed refilling, not calculating how quickly she could move through the crowd unnoticed, simply present, seated, genuinely included in a room built for people who mattered. Ines had rebuilt the catering business considerably stronger than before the gala confrontation, bookings arriving steadily from clients who specifically wanted the company associated with standing up to casual cruelty rather than simply absorbing it. Enzo's public endorsement, offered without hesitation once the investigation fully closed, had reshaped the business's reputation entirely, transforming what had once threatened to become a career-ending scandal into a genuine point of pride. "I keep thinking about the moment I set that picture down," Camille said, watching the room settle into its evening rhythm around her. "I thought I was risking everything for one moment of finally refusing to shrink myself. I never imagined it would actually lead here." "That's exactly the moment that led here," Enzo said, meeting her eyes with genuine settled certainty. "Not because speaking up automatically guarantees justice. Because refusing to shrink yourself is usually the first, necessary step before anyone with real resources notices there's actually something worth fighting for." Camille considered that the accumulated weight of 4 years spent believing invisibility was the safest thing she could offer the world finally, fully settling into something considerably steadier. "I used to think staying quiet was just survival," she said. "I understand it differently now. Sometimes staying quiet just protects the people who are counting on your silence to keep doing exactly what they've always done." Enzo reached for her hand, the gesture carrying none of the careful transactional distance of their earliest meetings, replaced now by something built through months of genuine, consistent partnership. "You proved that read on a room matters considerably more than most people ever bother recognizing. I trust your judgment completely now, not because you handed me one useful detail at a gala, but because I've watched you apply that same careful attention to every single decision since." The evening settled into its comfortable rhythm around them, Camille seated at the table rather than serving it, present in a room that had finally genuinely made space for her to exist in it fully rather than in careful, invisible fragments. She understood, watching the celebration unfold with a perspective she'd never once expected to hold, that the moment she'd finally stopped shrinking herself hadn't simply cost her something. It had been the exact moment everything else had finally, deservedly caught up. If you'd spent years absorbing casual cruelty because speaking up felt too dangerous to risk, would you have found the courage to set the picture down the way Camille finally did? Or does real change sometimes require exactly that breaking point, the moment staying quiet finally costs more than speaking ever could?